Are you struggling to improve performance in your Spring Boot application? If you're dealing with a massive database and want to optimize your file downloads, you're in the right place. Today, we're going to tackle how to get the EntityManager from a CRUD repository. I completely understand your frustration. Working with large datasets can be a real challenge, especially when performance is at stake. You're not alone in this. Many developers face similar issues when trying to optimize their applications. Here's the specific question we're addressing today. One user asked how to get the EntityManager from a CRUD repository while using Hibernate for batch inserts. They want to improve performance when downloading files with 50,000 fields in the database. Sound familiar? Let's dive into this. To understand the issue, we need to recognize that the EntityManager is crucial for managing the persistence context in JPA. When you're using a CRUD repository, it can be tricky to access the EntityManager directly, which is essential for optimizing your database operations. And stick around. At the end of this video, I'll share a pro tip that can significantly enhance your application's performance. To get the EntityManager from a CRUD repository, the user should first ensure that their repository interface extends the JPA repository instead of CRUD repository. This will provide access to the EntityManager. Next, the user should inject the EntityManager into their service class using the @persistence context annotation. This will allow them to use the EntityManager for batch operations. Now the user can implement the insert method to perform batch inserts. They should begin a transaction, save the entities, and periodically flush and clear the session to manage memory effectively. Finally, the user should ensure that the transaction management is correctly configured in their application. This includes using the @transactional annotation on the service methods that require transaction support. Fun fact, did you know that Hibernate can handle batch processing efficiently? It's like having a personal assistant for your database operations, making everything smoother and faster. Now let's look at the answers provided by other users. An alternative approach suggests that if you have set up a local container EntityManager factory bean in your Spring configuration, you can obtain the EntityManager by auto-wiring this bean into your service class. Then, you can create an EntityManager instance from it. After obtaining the EntityManager, you can proceed with your transaction. Remember to close the EntityManager after completing your operations to avoid resource leaks. Now, let's dive into a different answer from another user. This user points out several potential issues with your current approach. They note that using both the service and repository annotations can lead to confusion, as they serve different purposes in Spring. The repository annotation is specifically for data access exceptions, while service is more general. They also mention that if you use the transactional annotation, you need to ensure that cglib is in your class path, as it's required for Spring AOP to create proxies. Additionally, private methods won't be accessible in a transactional context, which could lead to issues. The user suggests separating concerns by removing unnecessary annotations, like service and transactional, if you plan to manage transactions manually. They emphasize that unless you're committing after each batch, these annotations may not be needed. Let's move forward and look at another answer. An alternative approach provided by a user is to simply auto-wire the EntityManager in your service class. This allows you to access the EntityManager directly without needing to retrieve it from the CRUD repository. Here's the pro tip I promised. Always monitor your transaction boundaries and ensure that your EntityManager is properly managed. This will help you avoid common pitfalls and improve performance significantly. And there you have it. You now know how to get the EntityManager from a CRUD repository and optimize your batch inserts. If you found this video helpful, please subscribe for more tips and tricks on improving your Spring Boot applications.